All right, welcome back to the Real Football Show. I'm your host, Ryan Lam, and today we're bringing back the Other Things series with a debutant in the series or in the guest list as well. We have Amy Hall here. We're talking about Formula One today. Amy, how are you doing?
I'm great, thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, let's just get straight into it because we have a very interesting Grand Prix the past weekend. Some of the results might be expected, but then there's a lot to look into. Maybe like talking about a little bit in the short future, but then also just interesting stuff all around. Of course, we're talking about the Eifel Grand Prix back in Nurburgring, back in Germany, and the first thing to talk about, of course, Lewis Hamilton's 91st Formula One win, tying him with Michael Schumacher. Of course, have that very, very nice tribute from Mick Schumacher himself, presenting the red helmet to Lewis Hamilton. So, what are you thinking? Like, what do you think about the win? Some takeaways on the race as well.
Well, I think Michael Schumacher's win is really, really very impressive. It does solidify his place among the all-time greats in Formula One, and I don't think that any of us can question that anymore. The weekend was eventful because, of course, you had Michael Schumacher's record being equaled, but you also had a lot of action in for third place with Ricciardo getting his first podium with Renault as well. So overall, it was a great race to watch.
I mean, yeah, we gotta talk about Ricardo a little bit here. Can't wait to see what he's going to assign as a tattoo for, of course, his team manager, Cyril.
Yes.
But then it's of course, unfortunately, Bottas bowed out, so it was not Hamilton, Bottas, and Verstappen as usual. But you gotta say, like, just as a fan, you have to be happy for Danny Ricciardo because he's been around. You know how we all know how good he is, even from the early Red Bull days, and he seemed to like be edging so close as he got along with Renault a little bit better, especially this year's team, and now he finally got it.
Yeah, it's really good to see Renault back on the podium. I totally agree. And Ricciardo is a great driver, and it's always nice to see him on the podium, especially after how long? Almost 2 years without being on the podium. So
Yeah, almost 2 years that he forgot to do a shoey
I
at
know.
at the podium, but hey, he made up for it a little bit later, so
Yes.
that's fine.
Yeah.
But
He's
then
out of practice.
yep. But then there's some rather interesting conditions I would say for this race. I remember around 8 degrees Celsius when you talk about the air temp and around 16 degrees track temperature. Definitely not a good situation. Let's talk about how the cold has been affecting the drivers because although looking at the future schedule, we have Portugal, Italy, Turkey, two Bahrain races in Abu Dhabi, where it might not be as much as a factor, barring possibly Italy. But then this German race definitely presents some issues Formula One has to look into if they they're still like they remain as ambitious as they are to try and extend the season or add more races or knock on wood, if something like the COVID pandemic happens again and the schedule has to be moved around.
Yeah, I think that the really interesting thing about this season was at the beginning we saw something very similar with the heat affecting people's performance, their tire performance, and also their engines. And now in Germany, it seemed to be quite the opposite. We saw the cold and the track temperature being so cold affect the performance of the tires and maybe even the engines. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing we have to look at is the safety car restart. Of course, that's the one thing fans right now probably like the most because it means chaos. It means if like Hamilton has like 15 seconds on you, it's all back in one. But let's
Right.
talk. Yeah, we have to talk about the restart here because we've heard drivers like Hamilton and Verstappen who are at the forefront continuously talk about how slow the safety car is going in that situation, and their tires are no way near the operative temperature that they should be in, and that could be a safety concern.
Right, yes, it definitely could be because it is dangerous if your tires are too cold. And several drivers actually voiced that during the race, most notably Hamilton and Verstappen.
Yeah, and just staring on that because it's kind of hard, right? Safety car, like we had a conversation earlier. Safety cars are kind of hard to be plotted because, like, of course, in cases you have to deploy them, but then sometimes they just are adapt to go as fast. in those conditions, and in the end, safety comes first. That's why the slow speed, allowing the crew time to pick stuff up and stuff like that. But do you think there could be a plan with like maybe a rolling restart or like some type of specific, uh, cold weather contingency that F1 could work out?
Yeah, I think that is very interesting. And the stewards do have sort of a dilemma, like you mentioned, between safety as in speed and safety as in temperature of the tires. Um, Regarding rolling restarts, I do remember the Italian Grand Prix this year, and a lot of drivers were frustrated with the number of restarts that they had. But in my opinion, it really did make the race really interesting. And it sort of leveled out the playing field a bit by of course, you get to restart, but also everyone in the pack gets to change their tires without having to take a time penalty for it. So I thought that was also really interesting. I don't know how they're going to move forward with this, but it definitely is a big concern because it does involve safety.
But speaking of well changes and maybe new things coming into Formula One, let's move straight on to the next topic because this is a Grand Prix that I personally am pretty interested in just getting to read about it and just look into some of the information. We have the Portuguese Grand Prix coming up. Haven't been done since 1996, I believe. They had a run at around 84 to 96. Like, just talk about like last driver who won it is Jacques Villeneuve. Like that kind of speaks. And Williams won like a bunch of them at like the tail end. That kind of speaks to like the I guess ancientness of the race when it comes to both of us who are on the younger side.
Right.
But yeah, what do you think about just bringing like Formula One? Of course, sometimes they're forced their hands, especially in this year. But then they get to bring back something a little bit more historic, a little bit more part of the history, despite the track being brand new.
Right, and I think that's one of the best things about this year. We have been able to see a lot of different tracks being raced last weekend at the Nurburgring and also in Italy, Imola. And I just think that it's really fun to be able to see cars race there because I wasn't alive when they last raced in Portugal. And so it's fun to be able to see a modern Grand Prix being raced in a very old track. And I think it also is fun because the drivers have never raced there in a Formula One car. So it really is a testament to their adaptability and to see how fast not only the drivers but also the teams can adapt. So I'm very, very excited.
Yeah, that's kind of the fun part, right? Even like especially now that I kind of got to look at the new circuit and how it's laid out and everything, it definitely makes for a really interesting race. When we talk about there are 16 turns, a really high gradient difference. So sometimes when you're like getting off a kind of rise, you might not even clearly see the apex at the end when you have to like say go through a chicane, or there is like a couple of hairpins that could make things interesting, and a bumpy corner apex that could screw up, especially in qualifying where someone is trying to go for a fast lap. So what are some of your thoughts earlier that like with this race things could get interesting in a time where, especially with Bottas dropping, I would say 18 points guaranteed or like 15-ish, and dropping behind, like this could make things interesting and make for some good TV apart from the competition itself.
Yeah, it really could. I think, as you said, it's a mix of history and modern, and also it's a mix of drivers and their talent and their adaptability. And I think it's also going to be a lot of fun because it's not going to be so much about the machinery by itself. So hopefully we'll be able to see the pack mix it up a bit because people are going to be able to try new things and even take different lines because that's how old this circuit is and how far back we haven't raced at it for such a long time.
Yeah, and like when you think about it, there is a little bit more characteristic wise that could make it very interesting as well. Like you said, they could take different lines because this is a rather wide track compared to some other tracks, and also there is a very overtaking friendly scenario there with a good mix of slow and fast corners, and of course different cars perform differently in different conditions, and some are better in the straight, some are better in the bends and stuff like that. And with that mix, I feel like this just makes for a really good race. When you think about like the midfield, of course it's very much jumbled together, and they're sometimes good at one thing, and the other teams go for another, and that would make for a really interesting scrap. Apart from what you mentioned about, of course, drivers have to adapt because it's not Spa, it's not Silverstone, it's not Circuit of the Americas, where
Right.
you're going there year in year out.
Right, and even at the Circuit of the Americas, as you said before, there could be some curbs that are really detrimental to the car. And because last year at the Circuit of the Americas, Sebastian Vettel's suspension failed, and that, some people say, was due to him taking a certain line on the curb and taking too much curb. So we could definitely see some drivers taking riskier lines and therefore damaging their cars, while others take a more safe route and maybe are a little bit slower, but don't damage their cars.
Yeah, I think there is turn 8 or something like that. I forgot the exact term, but there are, like, your red and white curves, but there's a distinct bump up, little bit of a yellow curb. That's where drivers would have to avoid, even if it's only their like outside wheels clanging onto that, because, like you said, gradient and a lot of tricky curb situations kind of reminisce to Circuit of Americas, which have caused suspension problems before.
Right.
Now, looking at the bigger picture, let's talk about some future races, because we talked a little bit about the cold, and, like, just naming it again: Portugal, Italy, Turkey to Bahrain, Abu Dhabi. Would you say the probably the only like cold weather annoying situation might come from Italy? That's what I feel. But then the other four races, how do you make it interesting?
I think it's tough because you never know how the weather is going to affect these other races. I mean, they are hotter places to begin with, but maybe by pushing the season further back, the temperature might vary just enough to make it a little bit more interesting, so it's not the usual year. So maybe cold doesn't pose as much of a problem, but maybe slight variations in the track will. And I'm really excited to see whether that happens or not, and how, again, teams will adapt and drivers will adapt. It seems like that's quite a theme for Formula One this year: adaptability of both the teams and the drivers.
Yeah, just looking at it, of course the settings could be different. It's just the time frame has moved. There's a different you race in different circuits in a different part of the year. Where in the past, where everything's kind of consistent, and you could kind of bank on what you have settings wise, perhaps in the previous season, to make most of the stuff work, and then use the FP1, FP2, and whatnot to kind of go over stuff and do the final fine tunes and stuff. And now two Bahrain races, I feel like that's interesting if they're indeed going to switch up the layout of the track as well, because I feel like that's always fun with Silverstone. People were floating around crazy ideas like one going clockwise, one going counterclockwise. Of course, that didn't happen because the safety is not really there. Considering some of the bends are pretty treacherous if you go the other way. But yeah, finally,
Yeah.
finally,
And
yeah,
I'm sorry.
you go.
Well, also talking about that, aren't they going to race at Bahrain in a different part of the circuit? So it's not just one circuit; it's also the second part as well.
Yeah, I believe I read something about this as well. I guess it's just to like keep it a little bit interesting, because again, racing on like two of the same tracks, like, it's too easy by the time. So I would love to see, especially in like newer circuits like Bahrain and Abu Dhabi, and how they're promoting the sports now, of course, with their inherent wealth, and how they could make it interesting, especially in this scenario where a lot of things have to be constricted, a lot of things have to be smushed together, and leading to we having 2 weekends of the race at the same location, and some variety could come out, be it the naming rights, going back to the money, or also the track layout.